When Jesus teaches in parables, he's not usually looking to accuse anyone of some wrongdoing. Rather, he tells these stories to get his listeners to look into their own lives, to get them thinking about what he's saying, what he's teaching, to get them thinking about how that might apply to their own personal circumstances. Well, how about this parable? The owner of a business today would certainly not praise a crooked bookkeeper, as did the rich man in the story. But Jesus isn't teaching about finance here. He's speaking about our relationship with money. Let me share with you a more contemporary parable that might help us understand the parable in the gospel. Actually, it's not a parable, it's a true story. It took place in Boston a few years back. It was reported in the local papers. It seems that a man named Glenn James found a backpack on the sidewalk outside a TJ Maxx store in Boston. In that backpack, Glenn James found $2,400 in cash and nearly $40,000 in traveler's checks. Mr. James alerted the police, who found the bag's owner, a student visiting from China. The backpack and the money were returned to the rightful owner. The newspaper also reported that Glenn James was unemployed, and he suffered from Meniere's disease, an inner ear disorder that causes prolonged spells of vertigo. Glenn James was also homeless. He lived in a shelter. He lived off food stamps and whatever money he panhandled outside of TJ Maxx. When the reporter asked James Glenn if he thought about keeping the money for himself at some point, he said, a quote, "Even if I were desperate for money, I wouldn't have kept even a penny of the money I found. God has always very well looked after me." He told the reporter that the homeless shelter was a good living situation for him, for someone with Meniere's disease, because there were so many people there to help him. Homeless, sick, begging on the sidewalk. And he's able to say, even if I were desperate for money, I wouldn't have kept even a penny of the money I found, because God has always very well looked after me. Let's go back to Jesus' parable. No servant can serve two masters. He'll either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. It couldn't be any more clear, could it, whom Glenn James has chosen to serve. But it's not easy, is it? It's not easy to understand how an unemployed, sick, homeless man could say, even if I were desperate. It's not easy to understand how in his circumstances he could say, God has always very well looked after me. In fact, it might cross our minds, it might have already crossed your mind, that perhaps Glenn James is suffering from more than Meniere's disease. Maybe he's just a little crazy to be talking that way. Does that mean that I need to be at least a little crazy to take Jesus seriously when he tells me I have to choose between him and money? Well, good news. That's not exactly what Jesus is asking here. He's less interested in how much money I have and more interested in how it functions in my life. He's asking, do I choose to serve him first above all? Or do my finances direct my decisions and shape my choices? Which master do I serve? Which master do you serve? Jesus is asking us to think about that. I don't think Glenn James was crazy. It's just that in his circumstances that you and I would deem to be severe, dire, and desperate, in his circumstances, Glenn James continued to choose Jesus as the master of his life. And in that choice, it's just possible that he finds more peace and contentment in his poverty than you and I do in our abundance. And from our perspective, that looks crazy. Of course, it will very much look crazy to anybody who isn't friends with Jesus. And being better friends with Jesus is the point of the whole parable here in the gospel. What Jesus is really asking is, you can't be best friends with me and best friends with your money. It's only in a relationship with Jesus that I can begin to know and understand what he's asking me to consider. It's only in a relationship with Jesus that I can begin to know and understand the consequences, the implications, the ramifications of living my life as a person who follows Christ. And what does that mean? To be in a relationship with Jesus is to acknowledge that I need him, that I need his help, that I need to be saved, forgiven of my sins, that I need to be redeemed. And Jesus is the one, the only one, who can do that. It's actually pretty simple. I either acknowledge my need for Jesus in my life, or I believe that I can make it on my own with a little help from my wallet. If I do acknowledge my need for the Lord, if I really acknowledge my need for Jesus, then everything else begins to become secondary. Money, possessions, wealth, health, status, prestige. These things don't become unnecessary. They become secondary. And something, rather someone, becomes primary. It's clear to me that this is how Glenn James lives his life. He serves the Lord. That's why he doesn't think of himself as desperate for money. That's why he's grateful for the roof over his head at the homeless shelter and caretakers there to help him sleep at night. That's why he's able to say, through his faith in Jesus, God has always very well looked after me. Is Glenn James crazy? He's only crazy in his love for God, his love for Jesus, the Lord and the master of his very simple life. He's just crazy enough to find peace and contentment day by day, not in what he owns, not in what he has, not in his wealth, but in his poverty. I dare say Glenn James has found in abundance what we seek in our abundance, what we endlessly seek for and often fail to find, because what we seek for, we can only find in God. So let's remember that when Jesus teaches in parables, he's trying to get us to look into our own lives, to take what he's saying and ask, well, what does that mean for me? My circumstances, my finances, my shelter. Where do I put my trust and my hope? What has Jesus shared and stirred up in you in this parable? In a few moments, we'll go to the table of Jesus with the simplest gifts, bread and wine. These gifts were first God's gifts to us. So we offer God what he already gave us, along with our praise and our thanks, our prayers, our supplications and petitions. And in giving back what we've been given, we ask God to give us Jesus in the bread of the Eucharist. We ask God to give us Jesus. In the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You can have all this world. Give me Jesus. Oh, and when I am alone, yes, and when I am alone, oh, and when I am alone, give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You can have all this world. Give me Jesus. Oh, and when I am without, oh, and when I am without, oh, and when I am without, give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You can have all this world. Give me